The morning I realized my daughter had stopped asking when we were going home, I knew something inside her had already adjusted to surviving. Kids do that. They adapt before you even notice, quietly tucking their expectations somewhere small and safe where disappointment can't reach them. Layla was 6. She shouldn't have known how to do that yet. But she did. And that terrified me more than anything else that had happened in the previous 4 months. She shouldn't have known how to do that, but she did. On that Thursday morning, and anything else that had happened in the previous pull-up. Not a delivery. The kind of car that has tinted windows and doesn't apologize for being expensive. I remember thinking it had taken a wrong turn. Nobody came to St. Agatha's in a car like that unless they were lost or doing charity photos for a non-profit newsletter. But then the door opened, and the woman who stepped out wasn't a photographer. She was my Aunt Constance. And behind her, moving slowly with a cane I'd never seen before, was my grandfather Theodore Marsh, 81 years old, a man I had not spoken to in 3 years. A man my mother had told me 6 months ago had specifically written me out of his will for reasons she refused to explain. He looked at me standing on that sidewalk with 2 plastic bags of our belongings and my daughter's hand in mine, and something crossed his face that I had never once seen there before. Shame, not mine. His. My name is Claire Renner, and until 14 months ago, I had a life that made sense. I was a licensed occupational therapist working at a rehabilitation clinic in Portland, Oregon. I had an apartment I loved. A daughter I was raising alone after her father left when she was 2. A savings account that made me feel like I was finally doing something right. I wasn't rich. I was stable. Those are very different things, and I had spent years learning to be grateful for stable. Then my clinic got absorbed by a larger healthcare network, and my position was restructured out of existence. That's how they said it. Restructured. Like my livelihood was just furniture they needed to rearrange. I had 6 weeks of severance and the kind of confidence that comes from being good at your job. I assumed I'd find something quickly. I had credentials, experience, references. What I didn't have was an understanding of how badly the job market had shifted in 18 months, or how long interviews could stretch into silence, or what it would feel like to watch your savings account shrink by $400 a month. While you kept telling your daughter everything was fine. By month 3 I had applied to 41 positions. I had 3 interviews. No offers. My landlord raised the rent by $300 and gave me 60 days. Noticed that the building was converting to condos. Layla's school fees were due. Her winter coat from last year no longer zipped. I did the math every night at the kitchen table after she went to sleep. And every night the math said the same thing. You are running out of time. That's when I called my mother. Diane Renner was not a warm woman. She was efficient, well organized, and generous in ways that always came with receipts. She kept score of every favor, every dollar, every inconvenience, not loudly, but quietly in a ledger somewhere behind her eyes. My father had died when I was 12. And after that it was just the 2 of us, and whatever version of love she was capable of offering. Which was never quite the kind you could lean on. But she was family. And I was desperate. And those 2 facts together are responsible for most of the worst decisions people make. She told me I could come stay with her in Sacramento. Just until I found something. She had the spare room. Layla could share it with me. It would be tight. But families do tight. I drove 16 hours with everything that mattered loaded into a rented trailer, Layla asleep in the back seat. And I told myself this was just a detour. Not a collapse, a detour. The first month was manageable. My mother was pleasant the way people are pleasant, when they're waiting to see how much of an imposition you'll actually be. She cooked dinner most nights. She took Layla to the park on Saturdays. She said things like, "Well, figure this out together," in a tone that sounded genuine enough that I almost believed her. Then her boyfriend Marcus moved in. I hadn't known about Marcus. My mother mentioned him the way you mention a piece of furniture you've had for years that somehow never came up in conversation. He was 53, recently divorced, and had strong opinions about household routines, personal space, and how much noise a 6-year-old was permitted to make in a kitchen. He never said anything directly cruel. He was too careful for that. But he had a way of going quiet when Layla was in the room, a particular kind of performed tolerance that made her feel like a guest who had overstayed. I saw her start eating faster at dinner. I saw her stop singing to herself in the hallway. Kids notice everything. They just don't have the vocabulary for what they're noticing. 2 months in, my mother asked me to start paying rent, $300 a month. Which I understood, which was fair. Except I wasn't working yet, and my savings were nearly gone, and when I explained this, she said she understood, and then, the next day she moved my things from the spare room into the garage storage space she'd converted into a sleeping area, and gave the spare room to Marcus's teenage son, who was coming to stay for the summer. She said it was temporary. She said the garage room was actually quite nice. She said I was being ungrateful. I stood in that garage with a folding cot and a space heater and listened to my daughter ask me why her blankets smelled different. And I swallowed every single thing I wanted to say because I had nowhere else to go. What I didn't know then was that 2 miles across Sacramento, my grandfather was living in a 3-bedroom house that had a guest suite with its own entrance. That he had been asking my mother for months whether I was doing all right, and that she had been telling him I was thriving. Settled, she'd said, independent. Doing great. I found this out later, in pieces, the way you find out things that were hidden from you. Each piece worse than the last. The eviction didn't announce itself. That's the thing nobody tells you. You don't get a dramatic speech or a countdown. You get a Sunday evening when your mother tells you, very calmly over microwaved soup, that Marcus has decided to move his son in full-time, and there simply isn't room, and she needs you to make other arrangements by Friday. Friday was 4 days away. I said, "You can't be serious," she said. "I'm not a hotel Claire." I looked at her across that table and understood that whatever maternal instinct she had ever possessed toward me had been fully overridden by her desire to keep Marcus happy. I was 34 years old and I was watching my mother choose a man she'd known for 8 months over her own daughter and grandchild. And she was doing it without visible guilt, which was somehow the most devastating part. I spent Thursday night on the phone with every person I could think of. Old friends. Colleagues. A cousin in Seattle who let it go to voicemail. I had $230 in my account. I had a car, a storage unit, and a 6-year-old who had started wetting the bed again after 2 years of being fine, which her pediatrician had said was stress, and which I had smiled through at that appointment with a face that I'm still proud of for not breaking. On Friday morning, I packed what we needed into the car. Layla carried her own backpack. She didn't ask any questions. She just carried it, and that silence was heavier than any crying would have been. We slept in the car for 2 nights. I told Layla we were camping. She was 6 and she believed me, and I have never felt so grateful for the imagination of a child, and so disgusted with myself in the same moment. On the 3rd day, a school social worker named Priya, who had noticed that Layla had come in 2 days in a row in the same clothes, called me in for a meeting. I sat in that plastic chair across from her desk, and she asked if everything was okay, and I opened my mouth to say yes, and instead I started crying in the way you cry. When you've been holding it so long it comes out completely silent. Priya helped me contact St. Agatha's. She made the calls herself while I sat there. She walked me through the intake paperwork. She was matter of fact and kind in a way that didn't pity me, and if I ever see her again I will find a way to thank her. That doesn't sound like enough, because it won't be. St. Agatha's was not what I expected, which tells you more about my prejudices than about the shelter. It was clean. It was organized. The staff were tired but decent. We had a room with 2 beds and a window that faced a parking lot. And Layla immediately named the parking lot the Grey Garden, and decided a pigeon that visited every morning was named Gerald. She made a life everywhere we went. That was her superpower, and it broke my heart every single time. Mornings were logistically complicated in a way I hadn't imagined. 1 bathroom per floor, shared by 4 families. getting Layla ready, while managing everything in bags rather than drawers, keeping her uniform clean, keeping her emotionally regulated, getting to the van pickup on time. I was doing all of this while also applying for jobs on my phone, attending case manager meetings, filling out forms for emergency assistance programs, and trying not to let Layla see how thin I was stretching. Some days I got through it. Some days I sat in a bathroom stall for 4 minutes and just breathed into my own hands. 3 weeks into St. Agatha's, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. It was my grandfather's assistant, a woman named Helen, who said very little except that Mr. Marsh would like to speak with me when I had a moment, and would tomorrow at 10 work. I said yes with a heart rate that immediately jumped into a register I didn't know it could reach. Theodore Marsh and I had not spoken since my grandmother's funeral 3 years ago, where my mother had maneuvered me away from him with such elegant social precision that I hadn't even noticed it happening until later. She had always managed the family relationships. She had always told me what he thought, what he needed, what he'd said. I had accepted that mediation without questioning it, because she was my mother and I trusted the packaging, even when the contents were off. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark listening to Layla breathe, and thought about the last real conversation I'd had with my grandfather, which was at Christmas 8 years ago, when he'd told me that he admired the way I was building my career, and I'd felt so proud that I still remembered exactly where we were standing. He had never been an affectionate man. He expressed care through observation, through noticing, through the rare complete sentence of sincere attention. That Christmas compliment had meant more to me than things people said with hugs. The call the next morning lasted 6 minutes. He asked me how I was, really, in the tone of someone who had already been given an answer and didn't believe it. I told him the truth. I don't know why. Maybe I was too tired to construct a performance. I told him I was at a shelter. I told him what had happened with my job. I told him about the car and the 4 days and the social worker and Gerald the pigeon. There was a very long silence. Then he said, "I need to see you in person. Can you come?" I said I had Layla. He said, "Bring her." I said I didn't have a car today because mine was having an issue with the alternator that I couldn't afford to fix. Another silence. He said, "I'll send someone." The black sedan arrived the next morning. Constance stepped out first, which I hadn't expected. My aunt and I had a relationship that existed primarily at holidays, cordial and thin. Neither of us quite sure what we were to each other, outside of the category of family. But she looked at me on that sidewalk, and she didn't perform surprise or pity. She just walked over and put her hand on my arm and said, "Your grandfather wants to fix this." Layla looked up at the car with enormous eyes and whispered, "Mom, is that a limo?" It wasn't. But I said, "Kind of," because she deserved something small to feel like magic. In the car, Constance told me things in the careful way of someone who has prepared what to say, and how much to say at once. She told me that my grandfather had been trying to reach me for months through my mother. That he had sent money twice. That had been routed through my mother and never reached me. That when he'd asked my mother how I was doing, she had given him detailed accounts of a life I was not living. She had described my apartment, my job, a vacation I had allegedly taken. She had been constructing a version of me that was stable and fine, and needed nothing. And she had done it so consistently, and with such detail that even Constance had believed it until 3 weeks ago, when my grandfather had asked to speak with me directly, and my mother had run out of ways to redirect him. I sat with that in the back of that car, and felt something cold and systematic settle into my understanding of the previous year. It wasn't just the eviction. It wasn't just the garage room. My mother had been curating my grandfather's perception of me for reasons that were becoming increasingly clear. And the shape of those reasons involved money, and inheritance, and a man named Marcus who had debts my mother had apparently taken on with the optimism of someone who expected a financial cushion that hadn't materialized yet. My grandfather's house was a large craftsman in a quiet neighborhood with a front porch that had a swing nobody was using. Theodore Marsh was sitting at the kitchen table when we walked in. He looked smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I was just used to the version of him that existed in my memory at full height. He had a cane resting against the table. He had a cup of tea he wasn't drinking. When Layla walked in ahead of me, he looked at her with the particular focus of someone who is recalibrating something internally. She walked right up to him and said, "Hi. I'm Layla. Do you have a dog?" He said he didn't. She said she was sorry about that. He laughed, just briefly, the sound surprising both of us. We talked for 2 hours. He told me that after my grandmother died, he had updated his will, and that the update included a significant provision for me, and that my mother had been informed of this as part of the estate planning process because she was the executor. He told me he had also set aside a separate fund for emergency support for family members, which he had authorized my mother to distribute as needed. He asked me if I had received any of it. I told him no. He nodded slowly, the way people do when a suspicion becomes a fact. He asked me if I knew about the family event that was being planned for the following weekend. I didn't. He told me my mother and Marcus were hosting a gathering at a venue, framed as a Marsh family celebration, with the implicit purpose of introducing Marcus formally to the extended family as a serious partner. He had been invited. He had planned to attend. He was still planning to attend. But the agenda, he said quietly, had just changed. The week between that kitchen table conversation and the event was the strangest week of my life, which is saying something given the preceding months. My grandfather arranged for Layla and me to stay in his guest suite, the one with the separate entrance and a small kitchen, and a bed with actual pillows. Layla found a box of old children's books in the closet and asked if she could read them, and Theodore said they had been waiting. She brought one to him after dinner, and he read it to her, in a voice that was careful and slightly uncertain, and she corrected his sound effects twice, and he accepted the corrections gravely, and I had to leave the room. Constance and a family attorney named Bernard were quietly verifying everything during that week. The fund transfers that hadn't reached me. The communication my mother had sent on my behalf that I'd never written. The timeline of events. Bernard was thorough and unsentimental in a way that I found deeply reassuring. He explained to me that what had occurred potentially constituted financial fraud, that the documentation was recoverable, and that my grandfather had every right to modify his legal arrangements as he saw fit. He also told me, gently, that these things could be handled quietly, or they could be handled publicly, and that the choice, to some extent, was mine. I thought about Layla in the garage room smelling her blankets. I told Bernard I trusted my grandfather's judgment. The night before the event, my grandfather knocked on the door of the guest suite. Layla was asleep. He stood in the doorway and said he wanted to tell me something. I sat on the small sofa, and he sat in the chair across from it, and he said that he had not been a present grandfather. That he had trusted systems and intermediaries when he should have shown up himself. That my grandmother had been the one who maintained relationships. And after she was gone, he had let other people fill that function. And he had been careless about who was filling it. He said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He said he was asking if we could start from where we were. I said yes. He nodded. He stood up to leave. At the door he paused and said, "She's a good kid, your daughter." I said I knew. He said, "You did that." I didn't say anything. He left. I sat in the quiet for a long time. The venue was a hotel ballroom 20 minutes from my grandfather's house. 43 relatives, catered dinner, a small band, and a slideshow my mother had clearly spent significant time curating, because she understood presentation the way some people understand weapons. Layla stayed with Helen, my grandfather's assistant, who had brought activities and more enthusiasm than any of us were feeling. I wore the nicest thing I had brought from storage. A dark blue dress that was a year old and slightly too big because I had lost weight. Constance touched my shoulder before we went in and said, "You look like yourself." It was the right thing to say. My mother saw me from across the room, and every muscle in her face rearranged itself in the space of 2 seconds. She had not known I would be there. I watched her calculate, watched the smile reattach, watched her cross the room with the particular grace of a woman who has practiced composure her entire adult life. She hugged me with the same warmth she had always performed and said she was so glad I could make it, and asked how Layla was. I said fine. I said we were good. I let her believe for 20 minutes that this was a normal family evening. Marcus was cordial. The relatives were loud and affectionate in the way of large families who only see each other at events. I ate a bread roll and let the time pass. My grandfather arrived at 7:15. He didn't make an entrance. He simply appeared, steady with his cane. And the people who loved him moved toward him naturally. And the people who were using him stiffened, which made identifying the second group very easy. My mother's expression, when she saw Theodore cross the room toward me, rather than toward her, shifted from composed to something that had no polite name. Bernard was there. He sat at the far end of the room near the small table that had been set up with a projector for the slideshow. My mother had planned to use that projector. Bernard also planned to use it, but not for the same content. At 8 o'clock, when my mother was about to stand and begin the presentation she'd prepared, my grandfather stood first. He thanked everyone for coming. He said he wanted to share something before dinner. He nodded to Bernard. The first thing that appeared on the screen was not a family photo. It was a financial transfer document with my mother's name on it, amounts and dates. The room got very quiet in the particular way that happens when people realize they are witnessing something real. My grandfather spoke for 7 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He had the controlled delivery of a man who had spent 50 years in business and understood that emotion undermined credibility. He explained the fund. He explained its purpose. He explained what the documentation showed. He explained what my mother had told him, and what the truth had been. He did not editorialize. He did not describe the shelter by name or in detail. He said only that his granddaughter and great-granddaughter had needed help that had been intentionally withheld, and that this had occurred while his resources were being redirected elsewhere. He said he was making changes to his estate arrangements, effective immediately, and that Bernard would be in contact with the relevant parties. My mother started to cry before he finished. She turned to me and said my name in the voice she used when she wanted me to intervene on her behalf, when she had always used me as the softest place to direct her appeals. Marcus put his hand on her shoulder, and then removed it when he registered the faces around the room, calculating his own position. An uncle I barely knew was shaking his head. A cousin had her hand over her mouth. The band had not started playing. Nobody was eating. I stood up because I felt like I should, or maybe because sitting felt passive in a way I was done with. I said only one thing. I said that I wasn't there for an apology, because apologies could be performed, and she had always been excellent at performance. And what I needed wasn't a performance, it was for my daughter to grow up in a home that was actually hers, and that was going to happen regardless of what happened in this room. Then I sat back down. Someone started clapping. I don't know who, it wasn't many people. But it was enough. We left before dessert. My grandfather walked with us to the lobby. Layla appeared from the side room, where Helen had been entertaining her, and immediately grabbed Theodore's free hand, like it was the most natural thing in the world. And he looked down at her with an expression I don't have words for. In the car on the way back, Layla asked if we were going to live with Grandpa Theodore. I said maybe for a little while we figured things out. She said okay. She said Gerald the pigeon would miss her. I told her Gerald was resilient. She accepted this. 6 months later, we have an apartment 10 minutes from my grandfather's house. It's a real apartment with real drawers and Layla's drawings on the refrigerator, and a window that gets good afternoon light. I went back to work. Not in Portland, but at a clinic here that had a position I didn't have to fight for, just apply for, and get. Layla is in a school she likes. She has a best friend named Rosario, who comes over on Saturdays, and the two of them treat Gerald the pigeon's absence like an ongoing tragedy deserving of weekly memorial. Theodore comes for dinner on Wednesdays, And he is learning, slowly, what it means to show up in small ways after a lifetime of big ones. He and Layla are working through a box set of illustrated science books she found in his guest room closet that she refuses to acknowledge might be too old for her. My mother did not go to jail. The attorney explained the complexity of proving intent with family funds in civil versus criminal terms. And my grandfather made the decision he felt was right, which was recovery of the redirected amounts and a complete severance. She called me twice after the event. I answered the second time. She said she had been under enormous financial pressure. She said she had always intended to fix it. She said family is complicated. I told her that I agreed with that last part, and then I ended the call. It was not dramatic. It was just finished. What I think about now, when I think about that morning outside St. Agatha's and the black sedan pulling up, and my grandfather getting out with his cane, is not the relief or the revelation, or even the justice of what followed. What I think about is Layla's hand in mine on that sidewalk. How small it was. How steady. How she wasn't scared because she trusted me, even when I had no idea what was coming. Even when I had nothing to give her except the truth that I was there. That's the thing about surviving something with a child beside you. They don't remember the shelter or the car or the garage or the cold. They remember whether you held on. She held on. So did I. And then, eventually, someone held on for us. Tell me in the comments, what would you have said to your mother in that ballroom? And if this story meant something to you, subscribe. Because there are more coming, and they don't get any less complicated.